Something inside you has already begun separating you from the noise of collective existence. You feel it, do you not? This growing distance between yourself and the world you once navigated with ease. The conscious mind interprets this as loneliness, perhaps even as failure, a sign that something has gone wrong in your capacity to connect. But what is occurring beneath awareness is far more profound than the ego can comprehend. This withdrawal you experience, this increasing inability to participate in the collective dance, it is not evidence of deterioration. It is evidence of transformation. And though every fiber of your socialized self resists this truth, something deeper within you recognizes it. Something that has been waiting, perhaps for years, to emerge from beneath the persona you constructed to survive in a world that values conformity over authenticity. According to my research into the process of individuation, there exists a stage where the psyche must withdraw from the collective in order to discover what is authentically individual. This is not optional. It is not a choice made by the conscious will. The unconscious, in its wisdom, creates conditions that make continued immersion in collective life unbearable. It manufactures a crisis of participation, and it does so deliberately, because there is work that can only be done in solitude. Through years of studying the patterns of psychological development, one truth became clear. The psyche will sacrifice connection to preserve authenticity. When the two come into conflict, when the price of belonging becomes the abandonment of the self, the unconscious intervenes. It creates symptoms: exhaustion after social gatherings, inability to tolerate superficial conversation, a strange heaviness that settles over you in crowds. These are not signs of social anxiety or depression, though they may wear those masks. These are the psyche's refusal to continue betraying itself for the comfort of collective approval. You have been taught to interpret isolation as pathology. Every message you have received from the collective insists that connection is health, that withdrawal is illness, that solitude is something to be fixed or medicated away. But the collective cannot afford to tell you the truth, that some souls require periods of profound aloneness to complete their development. Because if too many people withdrew simultaneously to do the work of individuation, the collective structure would collapse. So it pathologizes the very process that creates conscious individuals. This is why your isolation feels so shameful. You are fighting against years of conditioning that insists something is wrong with you. But what if nothing is wrong? What if everything is proceeding exactly as it must? What if the pain you feel is not the pain of failure, but the pain of growth? The same pain the seed experiences as its shell cracks open in the dark earth. The revelation I must share with you now will challenge everything you've been told about what it means to be human. Your isolation is not evidence of brokenness or inability to connect. It is the psyche's deliberate mechanism for forcing confrontation with the unconscious. What appears as social death is actually the first stage of psychological rebirth, and this process, though it separates you from the world you once knew, is the only path to becoming who you actually are beneath the layers of collective conditioning. The unconscious operates according to its own intelligence, and that intelligence is older and wiser than the ego's frantic attempts to maintain social belonging. When individuation begins, the unconscious withdraws energy from external pursuits and redirects it inward. This is experienced as isolation, but it is actually concentration, the gathering of psychic energy needed for the work of self-discovery. You are not losing your ability to connect. You are being prepared for a different quality of connection, one that requires you to know yourself first. But here is where it becomes disturbing. The collective will not support this process. It cannot. The collective requires your participation, your energy, your continued investment in its structures and values. When you withdraw, even temporarily, you are perceived as a threat. Not consciously, perhaps, but the collective unconscious recognizes when one of its members begins the process of individuation, and it responds with pressure to conform. This is why your isolation feels so heavy. You are not only fighting your own fear, you are fighting the weight of collective disapproval. The first sign reveals itself in your relationship with superficial conversation, where once you could navigate small talk with ease, perhaps even enjoyment, it has now become increasingly unbearable. This is not arrogance. This is not superiority. This is the psyche's growing awareness of depth. The unconscious, having tasted authentic meaning, can no longer tolerate the performance of meaningless social ritual. Every conversation about weather or weekend plans feels like a betrayal of something essential within you. What emerges from analytical work is a pattern. The psyche begins to hunger for substance. Once this hunger awakens, it cannot be satisfied with the shallow exchanges that constitute most social interaction. You find yourself unable to participate in conversations that once seemed normal. Not because you judge those conversations as worthless, but because your psychic energy will no longer flow in that direction. The unconscious has withdrawn its investment from the superficial and redirected it toward the search for meaning. This creates a profound loneliness. You stand in rooms full of people, engaged in the rituals of connection, and feel utterly alone. More alone, perhaps, than when you sit in actual solitude. Because the loneliness of being surrounded by people with whom you cannot speak truthfully is far more painful than the loneliness of physical isolation. At least in solitude, you are not pretending. At least in aloneness, you are not betraying yourself with every word you speak. Second, you notice a strange exhaustion after social gatherings that once energized you. This is critical. The extroverted activities that used to replenish you now drain something essential. You attend the party, play the role, smile at the appropriate moments, and return home feeling as though you have run a marathon, not physically tired, psychically depleted, as if the mask required for collective participation now costs more energy than you possess. Depth psychology reveals that this exhaustion is not weakness, it is information. The psyche is telling you that the energy required to maintain the persona, the social mask we wear to navigate collective life, has become unsustainable. Something in you has grown too large to fit inside the old costume. The authentic self, pressing against the boundaries of the persona, creates friction. And that friction manifests as exhaustion. In my clinical work, this pattern emerged repeatedly. Individuals would describe feeling drained after interactions that should have been pleasurable. They would speak of needing days to recover from an evening of socializing, and they would interpret this as evidence of social anxiety or depression. But what I observed was different. What I saw was the psyche's refusal to continue investing energy in performances that no longer serve the process of individuation. The unconscious was saying no, and the exhaustion was its voice. The third stage manifests as a refined ability to sense inauthenticity. You have developed, perhaps without realizing it, an almost painful sensitivity to pretense. You can feel when someone is performing rather than being. You notice the gap between words and energy, between smile and sentiment. And once you can sense this gap, most social environments feel hollow or performative, not because people are deliberately fake, but because the collective requires a certain level of performance for cohesion. And you can no longer participate in that performance without feeling like you are dying inside. This sensitivity is not a curse, though it feels like one. The psyche, in its wisdom, has sharpened your perception as preparation for the work ahead. You cannot integrate the shadow while remaining blind to inauthenticity. You cannot become conscious while tolerating pretense, especially your own. So the unconscious removes your ability to participate comfortably in collective illusion. It makes the performance unbearable, and in doing so, it forces you toward truth. But here is what you must understand. This is only the surface. Beneath lies a mechanism far more sophisticated than simple social discomfort. The unconscious is not randomly creating symptoms. It is systematically removing your investment in the collective in order to redirect that energy toward the self. Every social interaction that leaves you feeling empty, every gathering that exhausts rather than energizes, every moment of sensing inauthenticity, these are not problems to be solved. These are the psyche's way of saying, your work is elsewhere now. What emerges forth is a pull towards solitary practices that once seemed indulgent but now feel necessary. Reading, contemplation, creative work, long walks alone, these activities that you once squeezed into the margins of your life now demand center stage. And when you engage in them, you feel more alive than you do in any social setting, more yourself, more connected to something essential that has no name but fills you with a sense of rightness the collective world never provided. The psyche operates in ways that contradict everything the collective has taught you about what constitutes a healthy life. The collective insists that connection is paramount, that isolation is dangerous, that productivity and social engagement are the measures of well-being. But individuation requires periods of profound withdrawal. It requires time in the metaphorical cave, time in the darkness, time alone with the contents of your own unconscious. And the psyche will create whatever conditions are necessary to give you that time. You may have noticed that your desire for solitude has increased in proportion to your inability to tolerate superficial connection. This is not coincidence. As the psyche withdraws energy from external performance, it redirects that energy inward. What feels like isolation is actually concentration. The same energy that once scattered itself across dozens of shallow relationships is now being gathered, focused, directed toward the work of self-discovery. You have not lost the capacity for connection. You are being prepared for a quality of connection that requires knowing yourself first. The fifth characteristic appears as decreased need for external validation. The opinions of others, which once held tremendous power over your sense of self-worth, begin losing their gravitational pull. You still notice them. You may still feel the old reflexive desire for approval, but something has shifted. There is a growing awareness that no amount of external validation can satisfy the hunger that has awakened within you. Because what you hunger for now is not approval, it is authenticity, and authenticity cannot be granted by others. It can only be discovered within. What became clear through decades of observation is that the self, that center of the psyche which transcends the ego, has its own value system, and that value system often contradicts the values of the collective. The collective rewards conformity, performance, the successful maintenance of the persona. The self demands truth, authenticity, the integration of the shadow. And when individuation begins, the psyche begins shifting its allegiance from collective values to the values of the self. This is experienced as a loss of interest in external validation, but it is actually a transfer of authority from the outer world to the inner world. This transfer is terrifying. Your entire identity has been constructed around the feedback you received from others. Your sense of who you are has been shaped by how the world responded to you. And now that foundation is crumbling. Not because others have withdrawn their approval, but because their approval no longer reaches the place within you that needs nourishment. You are being asked to find a different source of validation, an internal source. And the ego, which has always looked outward for confirmation of its worth, does not know how to do this. Beyond this lies a paradoxical experience where isolation increases your capacity for genuine connection, though with far fewer people. This is the great mystery of individuation. As you withdraw from the collective, as you become more yourself and less a reflection of collective expectations, your capacity for authentic relationship deepens. Not with everyone. Most people will fall away. But the few who remain, the few who can meet you in your depth, these connections become richer than anything you experienced in your more socially active life. The psyche has its own intelligence, operating beneath awareness. And part of that intelligence recognizes that quality matters more than quantity. 10 shallow friendships create the illusion of connection but leave you fundamentally alone. One authentic relationship, built on mutual recognition of the self rather than mutual performance of the persona, nourishes the soul in ways the collective can never comprehend. So the unconscious, in its wisdom, withdraws your energy from the many in order to make space for the few. And this withdrawal feels like isolation until you experience the depth of connection it makes possible. I recall a person who came to me in profound distress over their increasing isolation. A woman in her late 30s, successful by all external measures, who found herself unable to maintain the friendships that had sustained her for years. She would accept invitations, attend gatherings, engage in the expected social rituals, and feel nothing. Worse than nothing. She felt as though she were watching herself perform a role in a play she no longer believed in. The disconnection became so severe that she stopped accepting invitations altogether. She withdrew completely. And the guilt and shame she felt over this withdrawal were overwhelming. What emerged through our work together was a revelation. Her isolation was not evidence of failure. It was evidence that she had outgrown the version of herself that those friendships had been built around. She had changed. The work she had done on herself, the self-examination she had undertaken, had created a depth that no longer fit within the shallow structures of her old social life. She was not losing the capacity to connect. She was losing the capacity to pretend. And the psyche, protecting the authenticity she had worked so hard to uncover, was making pretense unbearable. 6 months into her period of isolation, something unexpected occurred. She met another woman, also withdrawn from collective life, also engaged in the work of self-discovery. And the connection that formed between them was unlike anything she had experienced before. They could speak truthfully, they could meet each other without masks, and in that single authentic relationship, she found more nourishment than she had found in 20 years of superficial friendship. The isolation had not been punishment, it had been preparation. The 7th and final sign reveals itself when you recognize that your aloneness has become a sanctuary rather than a prison. This is the critical shift. In the beginning, isolation feels like exile. You experience it as loss, as evidence of your inability to function in the world as it is. But as the work of individuation progresses, as you begin to discover who you are beneath the layers of collective conditioning, solitude transforms. What once felt like punishment becomes refuge. What once felt like loneliness becomes peace. This transformation cannot be forced. You cannot decide one day to view your isolation differently and have that decision change your experience. The shift occurs organically as a result of the work you do in the solitude itself. When you use your aloneness not to escape from yourself but to encounter yourself, when you allow the unconscious to speak without the constant noise of collective distraction, something profound happens. You begin to discover resources within yourself you did not know existed. Depth you could not access while performing for others, creativity that only emerges in silence, truth that only reveals itself in aloneness. From the perspective of individuation, solitude is not optional. It is essential. The work of integrating the shadow, of confronting the unconscious, of differentiating the self from the collective. This work requires withdrawal, not permanent withdrawal, not complete isolation from all human contact, but periods of profound aloneness where the psyche can turn its attention fully inward without the constant demand to maintain social performance. And those who complete this work, who use their isolation as an opportunity for self-discovery rather than viewing it as evidence of failure, emerge changed. They emerge more themselves, more capable of authentic relationship, more aligned with the truth of who they are. The shift from viewing isolation as failure to recognizing it as initiation requires understanding that the psyche sometimes chooses depth over breadth. This is not a choice made by the conscious will. The ego, if left to its own devices, would almost always choose the comfort of collective belonging over the difficult work of individuation. But the self, that center of the psyche which represents wholeness rather than mere social adaptation, operates according to different priorities. And when the self begins to assert itself, when individuation begins in earnest, the psyche creates conditions that support this process, even if those conditions cause the ego tremendous pain. Your isolation is one such condition. The unconscious, recognizing that you cannot become who you are meant to be while remaining embedded in collective life as it currently exists, has withdrawn your energy from social performance. It has made superficial connection unbearable. It has created exhaustion after gatherings that used to energize you. It has sharpened your sensitivity to inauthenticity until most social environments feel hollow. And it has done all of this not to punish you, but to protect something essential within you that requires solitude to fully emerge. This is the truth the collective cannot afford to acknowledge, that some souls require periods of profound aloneness to complete their development. That isolation is not always pathology, that withdrawal is sometimes the psyche's wisest choice. and that the pain of necessary solitude, though real and sometimes overwhelming, serves a purpose the ego cannot comprehend until the work is complete. Consider the seed buried in dark earth. To the seed, the breaking of its shell feels like death. Everything it knew, its form, its boundary, its very identity as seed, must be destroyed. The seed does not know this destruction is the only path to becoming the tree. It experiences only the terror of dissolution, the pain of the shell cracking, the frightening vulnerability of exposing what has always been protected. Your isolation is this cracking. Your withdrawal from collective life is this dissolution. And though you cannot see it yet, though all you feel is the pain of breaking, what is being destroyed is only the shell. What is being protected is the seed's essence, your essence, which requires darkness and solitude to germinate. The collective will tell you to push through the isolation, to force yourself back into social engagement, to medicate away the symptoms that make collective participation difficult. And there may be times when this advice serves you. I'm not suggesting that all isolation is spiritual awakening or that you should romanticize the very real pain of loneliness. But I am asking you to consider another possibility, that perhaps your isolation is not evidence of failure. Perhaps it is evidence that something within you has begun a process of transformation that requires temporary withdrawal from the world as you knew it. You who have felt the pain of necessary solitude now stand at a threshold few reach. Most people never question their embeddedness in collective life. They move through the world performing the roles assigned to them, seeking validation from external sources, measuring their worth by collective standards, and never once asking if there is a deeper way to live. But you have been forced by your own psyche to question everything. Your isolation has been a gift, though it has not felt like one. It has been the crucible in which the false self burns away and the true self begins to emerge. The path forward remains individual and cannot be walked in crowds. This is both the burden and the freedom of individuation. You cannot rely on collective wisdom to guide you because you are being asked to discover wisdom that transcends collective understanding. You cannot measure your progress by external validation because the work you are doing is invisible to those who have not done it themselves. You must learn to trust the process, even when it feels like dissolution, even when every instinct screams that isolation is dangerous, even when the loneliness threatens to overwhelm you. But you carry within you now a quality of consciousness that justifies every moment of aloneness. You have touched something the collective cannot provide, the truth of your own being, separate from the roles you play and the masks you wear. You have begun to know yourself not as the world sees you, but as you actually are beneath all the layers of conditioning. And this knowledge, though it separates you from those who remain embedded in collective illusion, connects you to something far more essential. It connects you to the self, to the wholeness you were before the world taught you to fragment yourself for approval. Your isolation has not been exile, it has been initiation. And though the journey ahead may require continued periods of solitude, though you may never again fit comfortably into the collective structures you once called home, you now possess something that cannot be taken from you. You possess yourself, authentically, completely, without apology or performance. And this is worth every moment of the necessary aloneness that brought you here.